I'm here with Lisa Miller, professor and director of clinical psychology at Columbia University Teachers College. We're here in New Haven today for a consultation on the theology of joy. Lisa, I'm so glad to have you here with us.
I'm delighted to be here, Matt, and this landmark event is absolutely thrilling.
You know, in the paper that you prepared for today's consultation, you reflect quite a bit, actually, about depression. An odd way into the topic of joy, perhaps, but you see that the successful outcome of depression may not be mere functionality or recovery, it may be joy. What do you mean by that?
Well, depression has long been looked at as an illness. Yet we find that there are reliable times in our lives, coming of age and adolescence, midlife emergence, where more often than not, deep growth is accompanied by struggle, at times darkness and suffering. So depression cannot only be looked at as an illness. It needs to be looked at, in many cases, as a developmental emergence, really as an opportunity. And in that sense, depression is a knock at the door. A knock at the door for what? Well, recently in science, we have in the past decade accrued sufficient evidence to say that we are inherently spiritual. There is a natural spirituality which we can look at in our genes, through an MRI, in long-term clinical health and wellness studies. We are born inherently spiritual. So the emergence that we're seeing with the end of adolescence or the dawning of midlife is actually most fundamentally a spiritual emergence. It's a time of spiritual growth. And depression is then a knock at the door. It's a knock at the door for spiritual awakening, a knock at the door for a deepening of our relationship with the sacred presence.
And so in your research, you've actually found that there are kind of physiological connections even between similar mechanisms involved in spiritual awakening and in depression, this kind of knock at the door, that there is this kind of moment biologically. What have you guys found in the lab?
Well, it's very much in thanks to the Templeton Foundation that this research has been conducted. There were a series of studies that myself, together with my collaborators in the medical school at Columbia University, together looked at depression and spirituality as potentially being two sides of one coin. In other words, is there a biological substrate? Is there a physiology that underlies both depression and spirituality? And how that sounds, how that feels, whether it is experienced as depression or experienced as spirituality, is based on our engagement, our use of our birthright, of our inherent physiology, this spirituality depression faculty. I could share with you some of the biological markers of that. So, for instance, together with my colleagues Myrna Weissman and Brad Peterson, we looked at a group of people who for many years had maintained a personal spirituality. Many of these people had done that within religious faith, and some people had done it outside of religious faith. But they all said that my spirituality is personally important to me, highly important. And those people, in a structural MRI study, showed thickening of the cortex in the occipital, parietal, and precuneus regions of the brain. The very same regions of the brain that would be expected to show thinning in people at high risk for depression or in people with recurrent depression. So the very same part of the brain that is thin and withered in depression is thick and lush and flourishes through a sustained personal spirituality. It's the first concrete structural evidence that spirituality and depression may truly be two sides of one coin. In tandem with that study, we also looked not only at the structure of the brain, but at what the brain gives off, the energy, the wavelength. Using EEG, we had the very same people with a sustained spirituality and those for whom it was less important come into the lab. And simply asking them to relax with their eyes closed, we found that people with a strong personal spirituality gave off a wavelength of a specific measurement, high amplitude alpha, which is the same wavelength given off the back of the head of a meditating monk. And the wavelength was most pronounced in those people who had recovered from major depression through cultivating their spiritual path, through the development of a personal spirituality.
And that's interesting. You say in your paper that actually folks who have developed a deep personal spirituality, a strong personal spirituality, are actually more likely to have experienced depression in the past. Is that
That's
right?
right. It's not like there's happy spiritual people who never suffer in life. It actually is through the road of trials. It is through a deep major depressive disorder that we are more likely to harness our deep spiritual lead foot, our sacred relationship. One way of understanding that data is that emergence of spirituality often first boots up as a half-empty glass of spirituality. We hunger for more. We have questions we can't answer. There's a yearning for a deeper relationship with the sacred.
The Christian theologian St. Augustine says in a prayer, he says, "Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you, God." There's this so theologians have long said that this is the fundamental structure, a fundamental structure of the human person, is this orientation to what's beyond oneself, and so that restlessness, that hunger, that desire. 2,000 years, right, of tradition saying this is a kind of fundamental structure of what it is to be a human being.
Of who we are, of how we're built, and of what we're doing here. It's such a marvelous point, and it highlights the importance of the discussions you host here at Yale, bringing together deep thinking theologians and scientists. Human observation is good and keen, and I trust those who've come 1,000, 2,000 years before me as much as I trust my colleagues today in the lab. We're looking at the same thing. Now here's a fun point. Those people who recover from depth of suffering, dark night of the soul, depression, through spiritual emergence, once they develop what you have just described in that lovely, lovely reference, they are 90% protected. We are 90% protected against recurrence of major depression for the next decade. So it is indeed a teleological process beckoned by depression through which we emerge into sound spiritual footing. There's shortcuts. And one shortcut, although I would honor each person's path, is that we found in our EEG study that the very same wavelength given off through a spiritual path as resolution to depression is the very same wavelength given off through resolution of depression through use of Prozac. Prozac and its mass application to our society may be essentially jumping over the hard work of spiritual emergence. Now, I wouldn't ever ask someone to get off their medication and suffer, but Prozac alone is not an answer to depression. In many cases, Prozac can be taken, SSRIs, in tandem with the deep work of spiritual emergence. It's not an either-or proposition.
Yeah, once you understand these spiritual processes having, in emergence theory, we talk about supervenience bases or these sorts of things, right? Being related to fundamental lower levels of emergence, more fundamental structures like the neurobiological. We don't have to choose between different pathways of causation. We can kind of have both and answers to these sorts of questions.
Indeed, spirituality is biological,
right.
Just as depression is biological,
right.
And it also is at once spiritual. Yes.
Yeah. You say that often if we over medicate or we tend to turn toward medication, we can end up in a felt healthy state of joy-ishness, which I think is a fantastic phrase, joy-ishness. We tend to want to talk about joyfulness. That sounds like you've been careful, even in our conversation right now, but that sounds like that's an opinion that could run you afoul of some of your colleagues, or this is a kind of dangerous or provocative thing to say.
Well, the medical field has really wrestled with depression, and we certainly do not have a grasp on depression. Depression is 1/3 as reliably diagnosed as PTSD and only half as reliably diagnosed as bipolar disorder. If two different medical professionals, two mental health professionals, see the same patient, the correlation of their diagnosis is between 0.3 and 0.6. There really is not a very reliable grasp on depression. And while symptoms travel through families, if we look at twin studies, and symptoms recur over a lifetime, there's very little consistency in the symptom cluster between people. So we are likely, as we look at depression as a mental health community, looking at a cluster of many different entities with many different etiologies, different formative paths. So I think we're on strong footing to say that mental health has not cracked depression, and that there might be a lot of very good healing going on in treatments that's not represented in our scientific formulations. There's a lot of room, particularly given the robust association in study after study after study after study between spirituality and protection against recurrence of depression. And given the strong biological markers now that suggest we really are looking at two sides of one coin. There's really almost a moral call to look more deeply at what spirituality is in terms of our possibility, our emergence, and our sacred presence, our humanity.
So if strong personal spirituality is so important and has such a protective factor, in fact, you say that it's part of our personal development universally. This is just part of what it means to develop as a human being, is to develop spiritually. What is this strong personal spirituality that you talk about when you talk to study subjects? What are across various different traditions you've done this? What are kind of the common features of that personal spirituality that you find?
So if we look across the many world traditions and the different religious traditions, we see time and time again that there's one dimension of personal spirituality which is by far the most predictive of health and wellness, the greatest source of resilience, really known to the medical or social sciences, and that is a strong personal relationship with the divine, a direct relationship, a two-way lived relationship with our higher power. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, that can take the form of a dialogue. And so in science, it's often assessed as, I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. When I have a tough decision to make, I ask myself, what really does God want me to do? That dimension of spirituality is more protective against depression, substance use and abuse, risk-taking, and is more predictive of academic success, thriving, commitment, and forgiveness than anything known to the medical or social sciences. That is the heart of the strength of spirituality as reflected in our health and wellness. Now, if we look around the world, that takes different forms. So for instance, in some Eastern traditions, there's maybe a sense of oneness, that I'm one with the universe, rather than a dialogue. That's a different cognitive wrap around it, if you will, but it is still foundationally a personal relationship with transcendence. And in the rich indigenous traditions, we may see spirit in and through all living beings. So Crow has shown me, or the Creator through wind and sun has shown me. This is, again, a direct lived relationship, immediately relevant in my daily life to who I am and how I make a choice and how I lean into life. When that is the lead foot, we fulfill the wholeness of who we are. That is the highest order of health. And if we look through the lens of science, that is the highest level of executive functioning because it has such broad and pervasive effects on wellness and on thriving. And because the effects are consistent and enormous, it can only be the highest level of executive functioning. It changes all else. It changes expression of genes. It changes, when the telomeres unwrap, it changes what's transcribed. It changes at every level of scientific analysis, our thriving, our health. So clearly stepping back, and we look at this rich array of scientific findings, we say this is who we are. We are inherently spiritual. We are whole and healthy when we lead with a direct relationship with the sacred transcendent.
And as much as you call that a relationship, and you push even in terms of dialogue and conversation, you at the same time insist this is not. I mean, this would someone say to say I talk to God is pious. to say that God talks back is madness. But you're quite happy using this dialogical sort of language, and you say this isn't a matter of kind of disconnect from the real, right? This isn't you say this is actually about a higher degree of attunement, of actual presence in the world. This isn't a matter of hearing voices. There's something else going on here. How do you distinguish that those differences?
It's extremely important, because indeed part of the sacred relationship is attunement and relationship in the sacred presence in and through all life, and indeed a perceptual sensitivity to hearing God answer back, and that is all of ours. This is our birthright. So to silence that is really a violation, certainly of who we are, but more egregiously a bigger violation than that. From a clinical perspective, there's a vast difference between a sacred dialogue and quite different from that psychosis. Psychosis tends to be narcissistic, it tends to be negative, it tends to be bizarre, right? The sacred dialogue is life-giving, it's affirming, it's beautiful, it's directive, it bears fruit. It's an entirely different experience. Now, certainly one person can have both experiences, but they are tuning in on different channels, and there are different dimensions of how we can journey. The sacred relationship is foundational, and in fact, twin studies show that it's literally about 30% attributed to heritability, the apparatus through which we experience the transcendent relationship. In 1997, and to be replicated in 1999, Ken Kendler, who's well known for his twin studies on various forms of health, wellness, and pathology, looked specifically at the heritable versus the environmental contribution to the capacity for the transcendent relationship. When he looked in people who were about mean age 30 years old, what he found was that the sense of I turn to God for guidance and I hear an answer back, that capacity within us is about 1/3 attributed to broad heritability. Now, if we back that into adolescence, what's so absolutely wonderful is we can watch that capacity booting up between the time we're 12 and 22, which these days is adolescence. We can see an increase of 50% in the heritable contribution to the capacity for the transcendent relationship. That is our spiritual emergence. That is spiritual awakening, as known through theology and through culture for thousands of years. And that is concomitant with the window of risk for onset of the most prevalent forms of disorder in youth. So we have to, we owe it to youth, and we owe it to the truth being revealed through science, as well as through our hearts, to see spiritual emergence unmet, unmidwifed, left willy-nilly, as the roots of suffering in adolescence and emerging adulthoods.
So we're back kind of where we started, which is talking about adolescence and thinking about this kind of really important season of life. And traditional religions, the religious traditions that we know, have always actually marked, though, you note this in your paper, they've always marked this season as one where the adolescent needs to be kind of shepherded by a community through this process of spiritual awakening, whether it's bar mitzvah or confirmation or other traditions. We've always kind of marked these moments. How do we do this today? What kinds of structures? How can we communally shepherd our young people through this critical season?
Well, you're so right. And from the view of science, there's indeed a surge of spiritual awakening across the course of the adolescent decade. The heritable contribution to our capacity for transcendence, for the sacred transcendent relationship, boots up along with other forms of adolescent maturation. And in fact, we see a 50% increase in the heritable contribution in essentially the expression or the emergence of our genes through the course of adolescence and the capacity for the transcendent relationship. Cultures, as you say, have around the world have seen this. As humanity, we've known this through time, and we've met the adolescent at this crucial moment and welcomed, honored, and guided their emerging spiritual capacity. So for instance, The Navajo in this country, at the first onset of fertility, hold a sacred space for over a week in which the young woman goes through a test of trials, many of which are for service to her community, such as digging a hole and making a corn cake. And then her week of initiation culminates in time alone, quietly in a spirit hut, coming to know her augmented spiritual powers. And this, of course, is led by her grandmother.
So
the passing of the sacred torch.
So it's communal, it's kind of larger than the family, but it's also familial, it's intergenerational, these sorts of structures that traditionally we've provided. We, by and large, often don't have those structures anymore. What can be done? What can we do to provide, what kinds of structures do we need to be providing our youth? Is this something that schools can provide? Is this something that neighborhoods can provide? Is this something that religious communities have to provide?
So this very sacred moment of emergence is beautifully embraced by religious community, because in a religious community, we have the shared spiritual language of a sacred life, of a spiritual life, that's lived out by people of all different decades in life. We can see people 5 years older who've just been through spiritual emergence, and we can see parents of children and elders, all of whom are living out spiritual values at different points in the journey. That is a tremendous gift, as well as the support and the interest and the spiritual values that guide the relationships surrounding the teen. Then, even if someone is not part of a religious community, there are things they can do. Prayer, even if it's unfamiliar, opening up the sacred transcendent relationship through whatever practice or form that might feel comfortable. And of course, there's a very broad and pervasive interest these days in mindfulness, yoga, the contemplative traditions. That does not replace prayer. What we've found in our data is that prayer plus contemplation creates the highest level of personal attunement, or tends to produce the highest level of report of a strong spiritual path. We tend to think in our lab of contemplative practices as opening the pipeline, clearing the mind, and engaging our natural attunement for transcendence. But prayer is a sacred intention. Prayer is a sacred dialogue or relationship, so that taken together, this can help a teen form a strong spiritual footing. And then the fourth thing, which is instrumental, is parental guidance on the spiritual path. The teen is flooded with hunger for transcendence, wondering about good and evil, wondering if life is empty or if life is full. And as a parent, if we can meet them where they are and link their felt moments of despair or fullness or transcendence with their emerging meaning making, the prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain and the back of the brain, we can help them hook that up, which is indeed the job of adolescence from a physiological perspective. We can set up a lifelong spiritual understanding that, once established in the second decade, is a very strong lead foot for thriving in the decades ahead. That is the spiritual path that protects us 90% against recurrence of severe major depression. That is the spiritual path that protects us 80% against substance use and abuse. That is the midwifing of our natural spirituality.
A lot of what you describe is very much focused on this personal, this individual kind of relationship. We've talked about the kind of role of family. What about peer relationships? How do peer relationships kind of function, or contribute or detract from the development of?
So there's been wonderful work done from the University of Texas at Austin showing that both religious community and communities built around service support the natural spiritual development of a teen, and that this is largely mediated through good friends, but secondarily mediated through the ecological spiritual values that surround the teen. So for instance, going to a school where there are many people with spiritual values does affect the spiritual growth of the teen. Peers are very important. At the same time, in my own lab, we've looked at the relationship between friendships chosen and the nature of ongoing child-parent relationships. And as you might expect, to the extent that a parent shares in a very transparent, open, and generous way their own spiritual path with their child, the child then goes out and selects friendships through which they can continue that deep spiritual discussion. The spiritual inquiry of the teen in their quiet moments in the basement with their peers is really a mirror of what we have done as parents to open up that way of connection.
So for one of the things that we do at the Center for Faith and Culture is we convene conversations among youth ministers that are practicing, youth ministers in training. And so they're largely, what they do is they kind of shepherd these sorts of peer groups and try to help, right? A youth group is a peer group, right? That they're trying to structure in certain ways that are going to promote good, healthy life and development for the teens that are involved. What would you, if you could give some advice to a youth pastor who's in training, or who's a youth pastor who's trying to figure out, boy, it's a Friday night is youth group night, and here we go. What am I going to do? They're concerned about depression. They're concerned about substance abuse and these other kinds of negative paths of development. How can they be? What would you say to them? What would be your advice to them in terms of how they can structure their youth groups to have this kind of positive impact?
Well, first of all, they're very wise. I find that youth pastors, youth ministers, and college counselors are ahead of the curve in understanding the struggle of adolescence expressed through depression, anxiety, and substance abuse as foundationally a spiritual struggle. This they understand. I recently gave a talk in Eastern Tennessee, after which many of the youth ministers in the community came up and said, "This is indeed why I've gone into this work. I am here doing this work because I know if I can provide spiritual guidance, spiritual community, spiritual family to teens who really need it, it will affect the rest of their lives. The rest of their lives have bearings, an inner compass." So there's really nothing that exists that replaces a youth minister. This is what I found in our research. This is what I found on the road in our many talks. And here's why. Let me start with some research. This work started 15 years ago, and it started in a lab, but in tandem it also started in a journey. Together with my lab, we traveled around to many different youth groups of many different faith traditions around New York City, around the country, the center of the country, the West Coast. And what we found was that for children who had no one else, absolutely no one else, the youth minister had a 100% success rate when the love, intention, and authentic connection was there. We saw, it was deeply moving, young teens get on the subway from the Bronx and travel 2 hours to a regular youth group meeting in downtown Manhattan, and pretty soon they'd start bringing their little brother, and pretty soon they'd start bringing their friend. And by the time we showed up, they said, "This is my family. My mother, she's on crack. My father, I don't know him. But I have a family. This is my family." And it was a family understood as held together by sacred presence. It was those young teens understood that really what our relationships on earth are about is a divine love. And that is a family unshakable.
Jesus in the Gospels is at one point teaching, and some people come to him and say, your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you. And he said, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" These people that I'm making this spiritual connection with, having these spiritual conversations with. These are my mother and my brother and my sisters. It can be this way that spirituality forms that kind of intimate relationship that can be sustaining. Hopefully it doesn't have to replace always the family of one's birth, but it can function analogously and support, and we have reason to think so from the traditions themselves.
And it's in that loving, sacred connection, that loving, sacred community, that the direct relationship with the higher power is often formed. So for instance, we'd often hear teens say, in the presence of their youth group and their youth minister, you need to find out how you pray. For me, I pray when I write, and I write and I write and I write, and God comes through me. Yeah. And that type of loving, encouraging, sacred community is the rich soil in which grows the transcendent relationship. And the data that we've seen on nationally representative samples also brings that to bear. So for instance, while it is the transcendent relationship that it offers great protective benefits, we find it is often cultivated through spiritual community. It is often cultivated through youth group specifically, and frequent attendance at religious services. To go back to our MRI study funded by the Templeton Foundation, it was the direct transcendent relationship that was associated with thickening of the cortex. But that relationship was associated with engagement in religious community. So there can be many ways to get to the transcendent relationship, but a very good one is religious community.
And through that spiritual connection, all kinds of health and flourishing life and an experience of joy. Lisa, thank you so much for this conversation.
It's a great honor to be here.
Looking forward to more conversation later today.
Yes.
All right, thanks.